Okay, good morning, everyone. Is everyone awake? I know this is the hangover slot, so it's like, should I speak lower? Too many headaches? How many of you were past 5 in the morning out there? Oh, you're probably not here, right? Yeah. Okay, so how many of you have actually seen me or my Twitter handle around? Okay, that's good. The rest of you are really lucky. Really good. So let me start with a quick introduction. I'm a Brazilian living in Amsterdam, which means two things. One, everyone thinks I'm crazy. Two, I speak with my hands. A lot. Exhibit A. Right? So people in this area, if this thing flies, dodge, please. Don't get hurt. I've been a developer and speaker forever, it seems. Actually, that turns out to be around 14 and 15 years. I've been contributing to PHP, to frameworks, to the core, all over the place. But especially, I'm like Sean said, I'm a serial user group organizer. I love creating communities. I love getting people together. I love teaching. I love helping people learn about new things, which is why we started Amsterdam PHP. And with the help of a few people who are in here, it became a really good user group. It became a fun place to be. So if you guys are in Amsterdam, third Thursday of the month, come hang out with us. We have pizza, beer, and talk. What more do you need, right? The other thing I have to confess to is that I have no solid Laravel experience. I'm sorry. Please don't throw tomatoes. I'm allergic to them. No, not really. So I'm going to be, I've read up and I have looked, I have talked in numerous times to Sean and made fun of him all the time as well. So I know a little bit about it. So this talk will not go really into Laravel, but I hope to inspire you to bring new things to Laravel. So the spiel of what we want here. Kind of going to take you through the 4 aspects of annotations. What they are, where they came from, why you should use them, what people are using them for. And then I'm going to go into a little bit of a hands-on experience on how to roll out your own annotations using one of the annotation libraries we have available, right? So first of all, what are annotations, right? If you go look it up in a dictionary, annotations, it's a note that you write next to a text that you're reading, for example, right? So you have that. You have your textbook. You're going through that, and you write something on the side. Like, oh, I must remember this, right? You're adding information to the information that's already in your book, in whatever you're reading, right? So that's pretty much what an annotation is. You're adding more metadata on top of it. In code speak, that's exactly it. It's more metadata that's attached to your code, but that can be read during runtime, right? It's basically something that's there, a side note, but your code can look into itself and pick that out and use that information for something at runtime. The runtime is the key here, right? The thing is that the annotation does not affect the program directly, the semantics of the code. It's not essentially a piece of code running in there. It's information that can be used later on by something else. Remember that. That's a key point to this. So the effects are only observed, obviously, at runtime. And that makes them pretty much like annotations in English, right? Things that you write down and you attach to your code. So they have been out there for a while. Java has them. This is what it looks like. It's kind of like JavaDoc. C# also has them. It's called attributes. For Java, it's been around since 1.5. For C#, it was there from the beginning. The syntax doesn't really change that much. One is very similar to what we know in PHP. One has its own syntax. It's part of the core language, right? And then we have PHP, right? So PHP has no support for annotations in the core. That's it. Anyone has questions? Okay, I'm kidding. So we don't have support in core, and there's a little bit of story with that, so I'll give you a little bit of what has happened. So back in around 2000, PHP doc was introduced. Are we all familiar with PHP doc? Okay, cool. It's basically the standard we use to document our code, right? That was introduced around 2000, around 3 or 4 years after PHP was created. And that's where this whole thing started, right? Up to then, they were just comments added to our code, which were described in a semantic way so we could make sense of them. However, in 2005, PHP 5.1 introduced a new function to their reflection library, which allowed you to read those doc blocks on top of your function during runtime. And that's the first requisite we had for doing something similar to annotations like Java does. We had to be able to read that at runtime. So that was the first step, and a whole bunch of annotation engines sprung up back then, but barely anyone knew about them. There was one European framework, I think it was Strawberry PHP or something like that. It was the first one actually introduced the concept, but there wasn't much usage to it, right? So it took a while, but back in 2008, Doctrine 2 was released. How many of you are familiar with Doctrine 2? Okay, cool. So Doctrine 2, which you heard about in the community day, it was introduced, and Doctrine 1, you used to have to extend objects to be able to add all of that persistent information to it. In Doctrine 2, they added the possibility of using annotations for all the persistence information, right? And they created their own little parser. They tried to put that in core in 2010. It was an RFC. It went through the whole voting process. Everyone screamed, threw some tomatoes, and of course it was rejected, like everything else is rejected in core right now. So they kind of gave up on that, right? And I was sitting next to the guy who was proposing the RFC at work. He used to work with me. And that was a fun process to watch. It's him banging on the keyboard and screaming. It was so much fun. The days. So that pretty much stayed there. In 2011, they started discussing. So this was supposed to be like annotations with their own syntax, apart from doc blocks, right? It will be something else, something entirely different, which is a good thing. Then they tried doing it as an RFC for in-block comments, right? So what we see now as annotations, they tried to put that in core as well. That stayed in discussion in 2011, 2012, and it died. And in 2013, they discussed again, and the conversation died. And 2014 went by, and we're still going. So there is no real desire of core to have annotations, much like a whole bunch of other features that changes the syntax. So currently, if you go to internals and you ask them about annotations, this is pretty much what happens, right? The conversation is over. It just stops right there. So I don't foresee annotations in PHP core anytime soon. So what we're left with is PHP as it's implemented now. So annotations in PHP pretty much look like this if you're used to the Doctrine standard. We borrow from what JavaDoc does, which is we use PHP doc, the same syntax. You have the annotations in the doc blocks, right? Which is good. And it leads off to a couple of things I'll discuss later on. So the first thing I want to note is on the difference of doc blocks and actual comments. Is anyone familiar with OP codes? Oh, okay, you should learn about it, it's cool. So OP codes is basically what PHP is compiled to at runtime, and it's this little, more machine language kind of thing, closer to what the parser understands, right? So when PHP reads your code, it breaks all of that stuff that you're writing into little tokens. So when you have a comment like this, it actually reads that as a T-comment block, right? So you can see that if you have one star or two slashes, that is a simple comment, and then PHP understands it as a comment. However, if you have 2 stars, it now becomes a T-doc comment. The difference between these, and it's very important to know, is that the first one is ignored by the OP code cache, which is what came in PHP 5.5. A new engine came for that, and it's something that speeds up your code insanely, right? So comments are ignored because they have no value, right? However, the doc comments, they are also cached, so they are available at runtime even if the OP code is cached, right? So that's a very important difference between doc blocks and comments. Cool. So a few more ideas. So basically you have here Java, PHP, and PHP, Java, and C hash. There are 2 types of annotations out there. We have the marker types, which are just, a word, it's like a flag. There's no configuration to it. And you have the parameterized ones, which have data to it. They have extra configuration. They have parameters, key value pairs that go in, right? Keep those differences in mind. Okay, so that's annotations. But why should you use them? I mean, why am I selling annotations to you? Are annotations right for you? I mean, that's what you expect me to come here and tell you. Truth is, I don't know. Annotations is one of those topics that's extremely polemic, and every time I discuss it, I hear different things about why you should and why you shouldn't. The real reality of it is, this is the developer community. These are the people that love annotations and use them. These are the people that hate. Well, these are the people that hate. Those are the people that love. I get confused on the stripes and stuff. And this whole part here is the people who never use annotations. Right? So basically, the moment you start using annotations, you're going to pick one of those sides, and you're going to stick to it. Right? So fine, I can live with that. But it's a choice you need to make with your team. It's a choice you need to make for your project. I actually had a really good conversation with Everzet yesterday that brought some ideas, and I'll mix that into what we're discussing up ahead. So let's have an argument, right? The first thing people usually tell me when I tell them, yeah, you know, annotations are cool, they usually start off with, but it's code, and it's in my comments. How many of you think that? Oh, that's really good. This argument is going to go really well for me. So first of all, not comments, doc blocks, different. There's a difference. There's a semantical difference to PHP, so keep that in mind. And what I usually say is, well, first of all, they're doc blocks. Second of all, doc blocks are first-class citizens. If you're not caring and taking care of your doc blocks, or if you don't even have them, that's not good. Everyone says, you know, my code doesn't need documentation, it speaks for itself. That's fine. Sometimes it speaks a different language. It happens. I've been here for 3 years. People speak Dutch to me. I just nod and say, yeah, sure. Nice. So doc blocks are really things you need to care for. So make sure you have doc blocks in your code. And that means, you know, you're paying attention to them. So the fact that they're in the doc blocks, you know, doesn't mean like someone's going to come in and just erase that, delete that comment, and now your code's broken, right? Your developers need to understand the value of the doc block, which means they'll also learn the value of having the annotations, right? So I also have another quote, because apparently they told me that you have to start a talk with a quote. It's a thing now, right? So I was talking to Ross yesterday, and this makes no sense, right? Annotations and comments, you know, they're like water and oil. Even if they're in the same container, they just don't mix. They're not the same thing. Don't get them mixed up. They're in that same block right there, but they're not the same thing. So that's argument number one. Argument number two is usually about debugging and testing it. So the thing about annotations, like I said at the beginning when I compared it to English, annotations are metadata. They're not actual code. They're not actually, you know, you don't have to test the annotations. However, you have to test the effects of the annotations. You have to, you know, make sure the effect is being done. You have to make sure that whoever is reading them is parsing them correctly. So you don't really need to worry about parsing the annotation itself. You need to make sure that all of the stuff that uses the annotation is aware of it, right? So you want to test whatever uses the annotation, not the annotations themselves. So it's not that hard to debug them. They don't really add obscurity to the thing. You know, as long as you have an integration test in there, you're probably fine. And then the third one I hear a lot is performance, right? Because we all have Facebook-style applications that receives millions of users. All of us. We're all rich. We're here just for a hobby. So performance is something you should be worried about on some level. Probably not on that level. I mean, if PHP becomes your bottleneck, then yeah, you probably went through a whole bunch of other ones before, right? But we all saw yesterday when Taylor showed us the route caching, how fast that was compared to not caching. Hey, annotations have caching. Woo. So it's not really going to hit that much of a performance hit for you. So it's going to be, you know, little couple of milliseconds here or there, and that's usually cached once and stays that way until you redeploy. Because it doesn't change dynamically, it changes with the code. So personally, I love annotations. I like using them. I have made that choice. I'm here speaking. I haven't been thrown out of the stage yet, luckily. So I really like them. And the first thing I like about them, and that's the main thing for me, is context. They allow me to add that configuration I would have in separate files in context. It's all in there, you know, as opposed to having them in a separate configuration file. And the second thing I like about them is because my documentation is all parsed by PHP documenter, which means all of that information about persistence and all that stuff goes into my documentation as well. I have that all available if anyone wants to see the documentation apart from the code, which is really good for junior developers. So I really like those two aspects. How many of you are using PHP documenter? Oh, more people should use it. It's a really good tool. The cool thing is, like I said, if you use it, and this is like a sample output of what PHP documenter does, it goes through all your classes, reads those doc blocks, and you can see right here that all that information about persistence also goes in there. So it's an extra bit of information that goes along with your code. Cool. So what I said about context, see if you follow this. Whenever you're creating a new entity and you're thinking about your business, you start thinking, well, I need a user, right? Then you start mentally thinking, what does that user need? Well, it needs a name, and the name needs to be stored. It needs to be validated. I need to filter information. You think about all these things about your code, right, as you're writing it. And then what you do is you open 3 configuration files, and you start stashing information in all of those files. Right? So whenever you change a file, you change the entity, you then go find those 3 files and switch them. And there are 2 ways to design systems. You can either design where these things are going together, right? Or you can design like Everset usually does. You have the whole domain model thing going, and then you have the whole persistence layer completely separate. There are 2 separate events, right? So if your code kind of grows together, whereas wherever your entity is changing, the way you persist it is changing, then it really makes sense for you to replace all of these separate files and put them together into the entity. Your whole context is right there. Whenever you change something, you know exactly where you're going. You're going to the entity, and you're changing it right there. That context really helps, especially if you have junior developers, intermediate developers, who tend to forget side effects of things and going through other things. Whenever he changes this name, that information is right there, and you remember, oh, I gotta change the database. I gotta change the validation that's attached to it. So I really like that. I really like that for keeping all that information in one place. So a few examples of where annotations are being used, and they're being used all over the place, from Doctrine to PHP Unit, Symfony, Zen Framework, everyone's pretty much using it. PHP Unit, if you haven't, how many of you use PHP Unit? Okay, good. I will not have to report you to Grumpy. It's good. So PHP Unit uses a lot for data providers and for managing the expectations, the exceptions you expect, which makes it a lot easier. Instead of like having to use a whole bunch of code to do the same, the little annotation goes in there, has the same effect, right? So if you use PHP Unit and you've used one of those, congratulations, you use annotations. And you didn't even know it. So that's one. Doctrine also uses it, like we said, for persistence. Also for associations and everything, so you can see here they're defining the column, how it's generated, all that information, right? So if you have seen Doctrine, you probably saw some of this, and if you haven't, you'll run into it and you'll see that this is a lot better than a whole bunch of configuration files all over the place, because it gets very verbose, right? This saves you a bit of typing. Another example of uses, Symfony uses it for routing and templating, also for validation. So you can tell what the route is, all that stuff is already in your controller right there, right? You don't have to, well, whenever I change this controller, I need to go and find the configuration file that describes it. So routing is all done in there. And then, well, all of these, if you look carefully, they're all configuration, right? They're pretty much taking configuration out of a configuration file and putting them into the entity itself. That's pretty much what you get here. However, there's Flow. Flow is a separate framework that's been around for a while. And it does a little bit more. It actually does dependency injection and AOP based on annotations. So it does all the auto-wiring that you do with the container in Laravel. It does that through annotations. This is kind of like a dividing line where you're changing, it's not just configuration, you're starting to have some real aspects of your code being described here. And you might want to raise an alarm flag if you're looking at this, right? This tends to, this tends to make things a little bit easier, a little bit harder to debug. and that kind of stuff. So there is a line up to where I think annotations should be used. Be careful when you cross it. This might be it. But hey, if you're using auto-wiring already in your dependency injection controller, then this might actually be just fine. Cool. So the idea now is I want to show you guys how you can build your own annotations, right? Because you can make your own custom annotations that have whatever effect you need them to have on your day, on whatever it is you need to use them for. So the first thing you need, if you're going to use annotations in your project, is you're going to need an annotation engine, because PHP does not have support, right? So the first thing you're going to need is that engine. How does an engine work? So I'll go through a few examples of different engines in a bit, but essentially they all do the same thing. You have code which has a doc block, which has a annotation in it, right? This pretty much is doc block. The annotation engine will use reflection to get that information. Like we said, it's available since 5.1. It'll grab that doc block. Basically, it's gonna. This is what PHP returns. It's literally the string with all the stars and everything, and gives that over to the annotation engine. The annotation engine will then parse that string and give you an instance object of that tag, right? So basically, every annotation that you use, every single tag that's in here, is mapped one-to-one to an actual object that represents that annotation. It's pretty much a value object that has whatever information you need in it, and represents this rule is attached to this property or to this class, right? Plus whatever parameters you pass into it. That's pretty much what the annotation engine is going to do to you. Parse that thing and map it out to the classes you have provided. So there are a few engines out there. Doctrine has a really good annotation engine, which is pretty much being used in a lot of places. PHP Documenter 2, since it also parses doc blocks, also has a lower level annotation engine. There's PHP annotations written by a guy in Canada who actually happened to be in one of my annotation talks once. It didn't get awkward in anything. And there's Annotations written by Cesar Rodas from Paraguay, also a really good friend. And they're all really interesting. They all have their own perks. The good thing is they're pretty much all of them are getting mature. Doctrine Annotations was recently split from what they call the Doctrine Commons. So its version number is a little bit lower, but it has matured at the same pace that all of the other stuff in Doctrine has. The only different one here than being Annotations, which is still, it's probably a couple of versions higher up now, but it's also, it's still an alpha, it's still not quite there yet, right? Good thing, they're all available on Composer. They're all standalone packages, so you can just drop them in and start using them, no problem. The only difference here is that the PHP Documenter one, it only accepts the string parameters, the marker parameters I described at the beginning. Remember, markers as opposed to parameterized. PHP Documenter only supports strings. So if you're doing just flags, it's fine to use it. If you do anything more complex, you might want to pick another one. The thing about Doctrine Annotations is that everyone's kind of using it. It has become kind of the default standard for all these things. So Zen Framework, Symfony, Flow, all of the examples I showed before are using it. PHP Unit has its own parser thing because it has like 2 or 3 annotations. So it's something you can really use. I picked Doctrine Annotations to be the one I use for all my custom annotations work. And I haven't regretted that. It's pretty easy to use. So I'm going to give you a few hints on how that goes. So just to revise how specifically the Doctrine Annotation engine works, basically you have to import whatever annotation namespace you're going to use so that you don't have to write the whole name in the doc block. So for example, here we're importing Doctrine Annotations as ORM, and we're importing the Symfony validator as asserts, right? And then in your doc block, you can put in ORM/column, ORM assert not blank, right? Which makes it very readable and easier to understand. The annotation reader inside of Doctrine Annotations will read that block, will parse it, will give you the metadata, so an instance of ORM column and an instance of not blank. And with that information, you can now carry it out, pass it to whatever it is you're using to transverse your code. And also, it's going to be cached for you. You can choose if it's a static file cache, Redis, or whatever it is you want to use, memcache. Whatever you're using, it'll be able to cache that, so you won't have that load every single time. Cool. So the example I like to use, and it's a library I wrote a few years ago, is for input filtering, right? Because we all need to filter input. That's part of what we need to do to make sure that data that's coming from the user is not tainted. And I wanted to do something like that, but with annotation support. And I didn't find anything out there, so I decided to write it. And it was also my way of digging into the whole doctrine annotation thing and understanding it a bit more. It's available on GitHub if you want to go check it out. That URL might be wrong right now, but I'll figure it out for you. So let me say something about the word filter. If you're a native English speaker, you know what I'm going to. It's a noun, it's a verb, it's an adverb, it's pretty much everything. So when you try naming things, when you're creating a filter class, filters everywhere. Because you then have rules, and rules become filters, and filters become filters, and then the filters, and pretty much you're lost. So if anyone gets lost while I start mentioning filters all over the place, just raise a hand, and I'll try to figure out a way to show you where I am, because sometimes I don't even know where I am. So the first thing, I'm going to give you an idea of a few elements that come in play here, so we can kind of understand where everything is. First of all, we have an annotated object, which would have something like filter strip tags in it, right? Simple annotation. What's going into it, it's a parameter that describes the tags I want to allow, and that's probably attached to one of the properties on that object. Second thing that comes into play here are the actual rules. So the rules are basically metadata. They represent the annotations themselves. It's a very simple data transfer object that basically is instantiated with the information that's in the tag, right? Like I mentioned, how annotations actually work. After we have that, we also have another thing, which are the filters. So the filters are the ones that can read the rules and actually do the filtering. They actually make the effect of the filter happen. Filter. So pretty much, you have an instance of that object, you ask it to filter some data, and you pass in the configuration you want, and it will return the value filtered. Cool? Then you have a filter service. So this is the service that's supposed to receive an object, figure out what annotations are attached to it, get those rules, find the right filters, take each of those properties, get them actually filtered, replace them, and return the object clean and ready for you. Everyone still with me? Anyone want a beer? Okay, good. You're still awake. That's good. So filter service basically will do that thing, right? It will do all of that, shifting things here and there, and get that stuff for you. And then finally, you have, obviously, the annotation engine that's responsible for mapping the annotations into the actual annotation objects and get you going. Cool? This is pretty much what it looks like in a very simplified way. So the annotations become rules. Rules instances are passed on to the filters. Filter service is doing all the orchestrating of that. The annotation engine is parsing into getting those rules. And then finally, those filters are affecting the actual object and updating the values in it. Nothing out of this planet, right? So let's go through the little parts so we can actually see some code. Maybe that'll help everyone get up. Basically, the effect, that's also really good. So if you see here, you have a string coming in like that, it will be filtered and only the tags you want, right? Strip tags, nothing really fancy about it. First off, the rule. So the rule, again, is that object that just represents the annotation, right? It's pretty simple. It doesn't need to extend anything from Doctrine itself. It just needs to do a few things. So as we can see here, the first thing we need to do is we need to tell Doctrine that this class represents an actual annotation, right? So the Doctrine knows that. The ironic thing is the way we do that is using an annotation. Inception right there. So we tell Doctrine, hey, this is a class, it maps an annotation, so if you run into this in one of the doc blocks, this is the instance of the object I want you to give me, right? Once you do that, what you need to do as well is you need to be able to handle, you can have all of your rules, all of your configuration that's attached to that rule. You pretty much attach it here. What I have here is a simple the default option system, which helps you write less code while you're writing the annotation. But pretty much, you're getting options in the controller, in the constructor, or you're getting them set directly. Now you have an object that has all of those parameters in it. So it's pretty simple. This annotation can be really small. But the one thing you want to worry about here is the single responsibility principle. When I first wrote this class, it was the rule, it was the configuration, and it was the actual filter. And it's doing too much. So split it out, make sure these are really simple, because this is where debugging can go wrong, and you want to keep those very simple so you don't have those issues. Little note on how you pass in the parameters. Basically, you have a default property. So it's basically key value pairs. If you don't name the key, it's going to use the default property that you define in that object. If you name the key, it's going to give you that. It can either send it through the constructor as an array of key value pairs, nice and easy, straight mapping, or it'll use setters to try and set those, either if they're public or if they're private, it'll try to figure it out. You need to do some of this work around it sometimes, that's where the default property comes into, right? So this is how the parameters actually get into your object. Cool. Then we have the filter, right? The object that actually does all of the filtering that iterates. And it has to do, well, the one that actually enforces the rule. And it's pretty simple, right? It pretty much extends a base class, and it does the filtering. It receives the rule object, which has all of the configuration right there. Has a value, filters it, returns it. Nothing to it. And then the filter service, which, as I described, accumulates a lot of different responsibilities, right? So first thing you need to instantiate, so this is basically the life cycle of a filter service. You instantiate the filter service. You pass in a reader from Doctrine. You're then going to ask it to filter an object, and you pass in that object. And this is where things are going to, where it's going to start picking up all the annotations, right? So it's going to use, from the reader, it's going to use the get property annotations, which is then going to read and get you that instance. Like we said, it's going to get you an array of all the rules attached to that specific property or that specific class. Once it does that, then the filter service will figure out all of the filters that are responsible for those things, and will update all of those properties with the proper filtering that was done. Right, so that's pretty much the life cycle of a filter service. It needs to do all these things, and there's a whole bunch of things it needs to do in the back end to handle all the annotations. The interesting part here is the part of getting the property annotations and how it works with Doctrine. When you ask it for all the annotations in this property, it's going to give you everything. That means it's going to give you all of the Symfony validators, it's going to give you all of the stuff attached to or the Doctrine persistence, everything that's attached there, it'll give it to you. So, but it'll give you all of those objects. What you want to do then is you want to filter it out so that you actually get only your filters and not a whole bunch of annotations that don't belong to you, right? So that really helps. You need to filter those out because you're going to get, it's going to be like a verbose output of everything. Basically what you do then is you stash these into a metadata class, which is pretty much a glorified array that will stash all of the annotations for you, which you can use later on, which is what the filter service does. So you may have noticed that the filter service is doing a lot of stuff, right? And I just mentioned single responsibility, and that's just to make it simple for you, because actually I'm a big object calisthenics fan, and I like to separate my code, does one thing very well. So actually my filter service actually has all of these things around it to handle it. So Doctrine will provide you all of the reflection stuff, caching, and the reader. You probably need to work on mapping that cache making sure it gets there. You do need to do a little bit of loading, but you need to instantiate all these different objects. And personally, I have a metadata factory and object Walter to help me go through the objects, figure out, okay, these are the annotations, these are mine, these are not mine, update this value, update that value, right? So you want to separate all of those different pieces. And the filter service kind of like flashes thing around from one side to the other. This is what code looks like if you're using the annotation from scratch, standalone. First off, you get the annotation reader from Doctrine. You're going to configure it to enable parsing PHP imports. Once you do that, you get the loader, which is also part of Doctrine, and then you push all of that into the metadata factory just so you have something that does all of it. Pretty much what you want to do is you want to put this in your dependency injection container and not worry about it. Right? It's configured, it has all the tools it needs, it'll be able to parse your annotations. Then once you have an entity, the entity has annotations, it has values. Once you pass it through the filter, stuff gets filtered. No real trick there, nothing really to do with annotations. But this is how you use it for filtering. Cool. So that was kind of the gist of where we were going with annotations, how you can actually write your own annotations. What they're used for, what I think they're useful, especially the context stuff, is what I really think sells annotations to me, makes all of my stuff be in there. But you can write your own custom annotations to do all of the different things. So different aspects of your business that you want to facilitate, you can go straight through here. And I will now ask you if you have any questions.
Does anybody have questions about annotations?
Is anyone still awake? Always a good question.
I was a little bit resistant to annotations, honestly, at first, because I wasn't sure how it dealt with separation of concerns and putting some of that configuration into those entities. Can you say something about that real quick?
Yeah, so the whole separation of concerns is really something you should worry about. As you're writing annotations, basically your annotation is going to be an object in itself. So that object is responsible for being metadata. The problem then becomes you're now attaching your entity to this annotation, right? And it's still code. It still has a purpose. So effectively, if you are coupling them. So you have to make a choice, right? If your entity is growing along with your model, all of that stuff is together, then that coupling is probably not something you should worry about. I mean, 60% of the applications we write, we're more worried about the persistence and just getting the application working. We're not isolating our whole business model. We're not isolating that whole thing. If you're doing that, then yeah, annotation is probably not for you. You probably have a configuration file. It's going to be easier for you to handle because your model is growing separately from the whole persistence stuff that you're doing on the other side. However, if they're growing together, which is, I don't know, 60% of the applications we do there, where we tweaking the entity here, updating the database there, and everything is walking together, then you now have the context. Everything is right in there. Right? And a good example of where annotations can actually help you. Yesterday's Elasticsearch talk, we talked about getting all that information back to Elasticsearch, sorry. And someone mentioned, well, do you pass in all the data? What information goes in, right? And then you have to say, well, you can configure and all that. You can use annotations attached to the properties to tell whatever it's parsing doing the upload, hey, this property should go, this property should not go, this property should go, this is the name you should give it. So you can interact with the whole Elasticsearch thing just by adding annotations to change the way that your object's going to be serialized, for example.
I do have a question now. I'm still kind of in the same boat as where Sean was. I'm a little bit apprehensive as to annotations. There's definitely, I can see some aspects of it where it looks quite useful, more from almost like a commenting perspective. So you're actually just saying that this object is actually going to be equal, or this dependency is actually going to be equal to this object or whatever. My question is actually around some of the examples you gave actually did look like code. It looked like you actually put in code, particularly when you're defining attributes and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of curious as to why you would do that as opposed to maybe calling a service or injecting something in that actually contains that functionality?
Okay, well, pretty much it's about context, right? They do, like, if you look at the validation and filtering, they do look like code. You know, you're asserting this is not blank. And if you look at annotation, it does simulate instantiating of an object, but it's probably more to make us familiar with what's going on there, so we understand, okay, this is what's going on. So why would you separate those things? Imagine that you have to always, whenever you instantiate your validator service, you have to pass in those rules. We want to do less of it, right? We want to do less of having to always instantiate those things. And when you pass in an entity, and that validator service can actually read and figure out, oh, these are the rules, those are the things, this is what I need to do on its own, it's saving you the process of having to make sure that that config file gets in there. That's already abstracted by the framework usually. You have your validator configured somewhere else, the configuration files are all in place. The only difference you're doing that with annotations is where they are. So pretty much this is configuration. There is no difference, right? The only difference is that context. If that's a value that's important to you, then annotations will probably be a good solution. If you're not quite there, then yeah, annotations might not actually be the solution. I'm not trying to push annotations into anyone. The idea is you need to see, is this something that's good for you? Do you like having that configuration, all of that configuration together, as opposed to me having to go look at like at least 3 different files if you're doing persistence, validation, and filtering, right? And this is all pretty mechanical. It doesn't necessarily affect your actual business model and your business values, right? Sometimes it's just mechanical filtering of input data for security.
Hi, very interesting use cases you gave, and so I'm guessing that part of the resistance in using or having this use of annotations is that as PHP developers you learn that if you delete a chunk of code that is commented, that should never affect your code, right?
Yes.
So in that sense, how do you go about, do you think that that's something that can change and that it's worth fighting for?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think, yes, they should be part of core to be something legit, right? I mean, it will be insanely faster if it's in core, first thing, right? That doesn't really make a difference, but it validates the fact that they're part of PHP. That will be really good. But even if it's in core, it can still be part of the comments. So that might not go away simply because it's in core, right? To the comments thing, that's usually the first thing that I get. And it's really, to me, that the doc blocks are not really comments. You're not stripping them out. I mean, it's not like JavaScript where we strip all everything because we don't want to have big files. We don't care. Our PHP files are huge. I mean, look at the frameworks, right? How many hundreds of megabytes do we have in them? So if you're stripping out doc blocks, if you're stripping out comments, that's fine, right? But there's a difference between a comment and a doc block. If you're stripping out doc blocks for no good reason, I would be more worried about the process that led you to strip them out than to the effects they're going to have, right? So that's pretty much where I focus on that, is you need to take care of those doc blocks, and they should not be just wiped out like random comments. So they're not actually comments. But it's a thin line. It's difficult to go into those and say, yeah, that's what it is. But it's pretty much where I kind of draw that line.
Hi. One concern I have is that at least in PHP, I'm not entirely sure how it's implemented in Java or C#, but in your examples in PHP, you have an annotation parser, and you're using your own framework or application to decide what do I do with these different annotation, they're class instances, so what do I do with these? And one thing I worry a bit about is that if you have like a user entity class, I would prefer it if that user entity class behaved the same in pretty much every context. I mean, it has no dependencies, so you'd think that that class would work independently, whether you're using like a standalone application which you wrote from scratch or in the Symfony applications. But with these annotations, it looked like you're highly dependent on the context. Whereas in other languages, like Python is my best example, where you have function decorators. They work standalone. Like regardless, if you haven't imported the correct libraries, it will just throw an error. But if you do import the libraries, that function decorator, which is like an annotation, will work the same regardless of context. So do you have any thoughts on like the difference here?
Yeah, that's also a very common issue. And yes, at the end of it, you are coupling your code to the Doctrine annotation engine or whatever engine it is you are coupling that code. Should you couple that code? That's a question of how you are architecting your system. If everything is walking together, then maybe that coupling is not really bad, because the entity itself will still work regardless of what you do with it, because none of this affects it, right? What's going to change is the way it's persisted. But then again, if you're using a standalone and another system, are you persisting that data in both of them, or is it just transversing through the system and going somewhere else? Right? So it's usually more about focusing on the effects. But essentially, yeah, you are coupling, and that's a choice you need to make. Right? So there is no brave answer of saying, no, we can decouple because we can then write this parser and anyone can parse it. No, we can't. It's not in core. Right? So you are coupling your code to the annotation engine, which could work or could go horribly wrong. It's up to the nature of the project, which is why I say, either use it or you don't. You need to figure out that by the nature of what you're doing.
Hi. I have a bit more a general remark than a question, but I'd love to get your feedback on this.
Yeah.
It seems that you're introducing a lot of hidden complexity. Something as simple as an annotation has a lot of code behind it. Now I know it's just an example because strip tags is a built-in PHP function.
Yeah.
But it seems that behind something as simple as the annotation, there's a lot of code behind it. So it seems awfully verbose, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so there are different aspects of how you're handling, and especially the filter thing. Essentially, any filter class you see out there, and there's like 3 or 4 of them, they are essentially wrappers around PHP functions, right? The only reason for actually having them is you want something more object-oriented to configure and reuse in different cases. So what you have, usually when you want to implement annotations, the very least you're going to need an object to represent the annotation. And depending on what you're using the annotation for, you're going to need an object that's able to have those effects, right? So those are the 2 things you're going to need. And then at least you're going to need something that can iterate over an object to figure those things out. So that's the 3 essential things you have. You can make those very simple. You can reuse things that Symfony already implemented. Some of that is also going into Doctrine annotations lately. So this code might not be completely up to speed. There's already a few things that are built in that you can use from them. But it is verbose. Unfortunately, since we rely on something that's not in core, there is a bit of work because every time you use annotations, you use it in a different context. So it is, which is why I tried to give this example of the path I had to take to be able to do the filtering library. And especially that whole filter service and everything that's behind it, it does get a little bit more verbose than I would like it to be. But I'm pretty sure you can simplify that into a little package that everyone can reuse if that's the case.
Okay, so I don't think we have time for any more questions,
Yep.
but if I could throw one thing in. If you're not sure about the use of annotations and you still want to decide if it's right for you, you can look at how they're used in other languages and the kind of consensuses that other people have come to, and that could help maybe you determine if it's good for you.
Cool. Thank you guys for having me.